Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to GM Philosophy in the Morning. I'm the GM Philosopher. Today, we're talking about how to create a truly diabolical villain. There are two factors that you must include if you really want this villain to get your players' attention. If you want them to love to hate this villain, if you want this to be a very successful villain in your campaign, I have basically boiled it down to two factors. These are the two things that every amazing D&D villain must possess if they're going to be a success in your games. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned. Let's dive into it. Now, if you are new here to the channel, I just want to welcome you. GM Philosophy is a channel dedicated to helping game masters to run better games. And I have a resource I'd like to give you. I've recently put together my Mastering the Game 10 Essential GM Tips ebook. This short ebook, about 7 pages long, contains my top 10 tips for how to become better as a game master, literally within the next 24 hours. You can grab this, consume it, read it, and then literally in your next game, you can deploy some of the tips and really level up your game. These are the tips that I have found are the most crucial for game masters. And so I would encourage you to pick that up. If you join my email list, link is in the description. You get that as a free download in your first email. The download link will come in that first email. You should also join the GM Philosophy Discord. Link to that is in the description too. But now it is time to talk about the two factors that make villains truly diabolical in your D&D game. Now, the first mistake I often see game masters make with villains is not thinking through their motivations, not thinking through their history, not thinking through why they're doing the things they're doing. These details take some time and effort to flesh out. And sometimes, especially if you have improvised a villain or you've thrown in a mid-level villain and you think to yourself, man, this villain, I really like them. I want them to make a big impact, but there's something missing. I'm having a hard time role-playing this villain, or I'm having a hard time explaining why this villain is acting or doing what they're doing or the way they're acting. And the reason for these things is usually because the motivations, backstory have not been fully fleshed out. Now, there are really 3 different ways to flesh out a villain's backstory and motivations. Number 1, you can use your own inspiration. If you have an idea for a villain and you have an idea for their backstory, you have an idea for who they are based on their backstory and why they're motivated to do the diabolical things they're going to do, then you can run with that. However, I do usually like to put a little extra flair and flavor on it. So, for example, you could also take some information from movies, from shows, take some inspiration from other sources to help really make that villain pop. Or you can add some details from like a resource, like a villain, source book or a random roll table book or, a details about villains book. There are some of these books out there. I'm going to show you the one that I use. Now, I wrote this ebook called The Ultimate Adventure Generator. It has 163 random roll tables and 310 print-friendly pages. And so you can purchase this. Link is in the description. You can also get this for free if you join my Ko-Fi membership, community support membership. Links in the description. But let me just show you what I roll on for villains. I'm going to show you just the categories that I roll on. So Chapter 4 is all about identifying the main antagonist. So when we come to this chapter, these are the types of things I might roll on. I might roll on what's the antagonist type. What is their motivation? Is it revenge against a personal slight, unquenchable greed, desire for absolute power, right? These really help to fill in the blanks for what a villain is thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. Their resources, do they have a loyal army? Do they have elite assassins? Do they have dark magic or cursed relics, right? Their weakness, I'll roll on that. Their appearance. Sometimes you already know what you want their appearance to be, but sometimes you aren't quite sure, and fleshing that out helps you to give some depth to that villain. One more quick note about determining how a character looks or a villain looks is I will think about, if they're humanoid, I'll think about actors who I think would be good to portray them. And then I will kind of try to mimic those actors, or I will mimic kind of like what they look like. Like, for example, the actor who plays Eric in True Blood, like the old vampire dude who's the sheriff who kind of becomes an ally to Sookie and Bill. I pictured him being my major villain Mazok in my original my first long-term epic campaign. I had this epic villain named Mazok, and I kind of pictured him being like the humanoid manifestation of Mazok. And so that just gave me kind of a platform to go from when I role played that villain or when I described what he looked like and stuff like that. It's very helpful to find inspiration from shows like that. Their base of operations, where do they operate from? What is their nature? So in other words, what brand of evil, what flavor of evil are they? Are they tyrannical? Are they sadistic? Are they corrupt? Right? There might be a mixture of many of these, but like, what's their primary mode of evil? I think this is important to figure out. Also, what is their unexpected power? And then I do have a D100 table of plug and play villain templates. There's the Shadowed Regent. This covers like who they are, their physical description, what they want, methods and resources, and then hooks about them. There's the Bone Caller, the Crimson Raider, the Silver Tongue. So there's a bunch of different villains in there. So if you were to, for example, like download that ebook, you could find a villain template you liked or random roll on one and then flesh out the details with the tables or with your own ideas, with your own inspiration, with stuff you've gathered from shows and movies, etc. Now, this will help to flesh out a lot of details, but this still doesn't help us to go back in time and talk about the motivations. What created this villain? How did this villain come to be? Well, I would also use my ultimate adventure generator for that, and I'm going to show you how. Now, obviously, you don't need to roll on random tables to come up with a villain backstory. You might have one already in your mind. You might imagine one. You might have inspiration already. You might be emulating a certain character in history, or you might draw from your own personal experiences. Parts of your life where if you had lived in a fantasy setting, you might have taken a wrong turn and become a villain. But sometimes a little spark of creativity goes a long way. So I'll roll on these NPC tables in my ultimate adventure generator. So things like the role, like what kind of role does this villain play? Now I understand these are key NPCs, but the villain is a key NPC. They are, in fact, the key NPC in many ways. They are a huge part of the story of your characters. And the reason for that is because your characters are telling a hero's story. They are embarking on a journey that will have a hook, a conflict, and a conclusion. And guess what? The conflict is brought about usually by a big bad, by a main antagonist. So you might want to determine what role this villain plays in their life, what personality they tend to have in general, what is their backstory? Are they a survivor of a great tragedy, exiled from their homeland, former member of a rival faction, trained in a monastic order? These are great places to start for character backstory, especially villain backstory. Then we have NPC nature. Like, what was their nature before they adopted their own personal brand of evil? What is their relationship to the party? Do they have one? I might skip this for a big villain because the stakes are probably too big for this table to matter. But then their motivation, okay, desire for wealth or power, revenge for a past wrong, redemption for sins or failures. Maybe they want to redeem their sins, but they're going about it by trying to create the apocalypse, sort of like how in the Marvel universe, in the movies anyway, Thanos believes he's justified. He wants to save all of basically all life in the universe by eliminating half of all the life, which to him sounds like a redeemable good, but to the rest of the galaxy sounds like a despicable evil, right? Quirks. Does your villain have any quirks? Sometimes adding quirks to a villain is a really great way to make them stand out and make them more lifelike. Of course, we have appearance. Now, this is a D100 appearance table, so you can roll massively on different appearance things. This is really, really awesome if you're just not quite sure and you want a starting point for how you want your villain to look. And then we have names. I have a whole list of female names here, whole list of male names. If you are just in a pinch and you need a name, you can, of course, roll on that. So we have really now talked about point number one. You need to understand the villain. You need to understand where they come from, what their backstory is. You need to understand what motivates them. Okay, so figuring that out will help you to flesh out a villain that is truly abominable, that will truly get your character's attention, that will make your characters love to hate this person. But there is more to it than that. There's also the presentation, how you role play the villain. Now, there are many different ways to do this. Some GMs have different styles for this. You might have an accents that you do. You might be really good at voices. For me, a lot of the times my villains will have two different things going on. I'll change my voice a little bit, but I'll also adopt a certain kind of inflection or way of speaking. That's how I do voices in D&D. So, for example, a great barbarian might talk like this, right? Something like that. So it's like, with that being said, it's also true that figuring out how to present this villain, if you're going to nail anything from a role play perspective, nailing the villain is important. And I actually highly advise that you practice your villain before the players ever actually get there. You can do this in a number of ways. You can emulate a character from a movie or show. You can just work through like mannerisms, quirks, practice the voice, practice how they walk, practice how they hold themselves. In my more like later campaign with my core group, where they are basically at odds with this group of Dragonborn. There's one in particular Dragonborn who he walks a certain kind of way, and I like practice his walk. He has like a hunched over walk that was kind of inspired by General Grievous from Star Wars. And I just practiced that a lot. I practiced the way he spoke. I kind of practiced what kind of speech patterns he used. He kind of tends to have a relatively kind of like formal speech pattern, but there'll be these guttural interjections that are really like, I would call them brutal and baseline. So he'll have like 2 or 3 very formal sentences, and then he'll just interject with something sort of coming from his rough roots, speaking to how he was once in poverty and once orphaned and once actually even, dare I say, like subjugated and oppressed. And he'll revert back to those kind of more savage roots by saying like a sentence that's constructed in a more savage way, and then he'll go back to formal speak. But figuring out how you're going to present the villain is actually really important for getting the players to connect. Getting the players to connect with your villain is one of the most powerful, one of the most potent tools you have to make not only that villain meaningful, but to make the game itself meaningful to your players. Without emotional engagement, unless players actually care about the stakes, you're not going to really have a very immersive game. Players need to care about the stakes. They need to care about what's going on in order for them to truly invest. And when you figure out how to get your villain talking, acting, doing things that will inspire emotional connection from your players, get your players' attention, get them interested, get them curious, get them angry, get them impassioned, get them even a little sympathetic, get them feeling like they're on the verge of being able to reason with him. It's a little out of reach, but they keep trying, and this makes them want to keep trying. These are all ways to kind of pull them into the story deeper and get them to care more about the stakes, and your portrayal of the villain is a huge part of that. So tip number 2, the second factor that's needed for a villain that is really diabolical, that really gets your players on edge, that get your players really wound up, this is have your presentation nailed. Practice the presentation of your big bad. If you improvise everything else, you're generally fine, but I always recommend that players actually practice the presentation of their big bad. Do it like you would if you were in theater, if you were acting out a role in a movie. Now, those of you who've been in theater, you know what that means. Those of you who haven't, that's okay. You don't have to be a professional actor to pull this one off. You just have to really be like intentional and knowing about what you want to present and how you want to present it. Come up with a theory for why this villain, like the 1, 2, or 3 different ways that this villain is going to pull at the heartstrings, pull at the emotions of your players. Go ahead and just make the theory. Say, here's how I plan for this villain to rope in the players, like to get them to care about him or her. And then you put those things out and then use those things. Use all of them every time they interact with the villain. And even when they see the effects of the villain's work, like if they find a battlefield or if they find a murder scene, really try to work all of those things into the scene every single time, the things you're going to use to rope the players in, because this will help build up that emotional connection the players have to the story. And that is magic for running an immersive campaign. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think? What are the most important factors for running a successful villain? If you are an experienced game master, you might have some ideas. I would like you to drop them in the comments. Let's continue the conversation. Share the collective wisdom of the chat with everyone who will be viewing later. I would really appreciate hearing and seeing your perspectives on this. I also want to give a big shout out to our Ko-Fi sponsors. Thank you so much for our Ko-Fi members for supporting us. Craig, our first gold level supporter, is supporting the channel. Craig, thank you so much for your generous contribution. I really appreciate you and all of the work that all of you Ko-Fi members do to help keep the channel running, keep it moving, keep it evolving, and just in general, I want to give a big thank you. If you're interested in sponsoring the channel, continuing the good work that GM Philosophy is doing in the Discord, on YouTube, and in email, then please consider becoming a Ko-Fi sponsor. Link to that is in the description. You get a lot of awesome benefits when you do that. And with that being said, that is going to be a wrap for today. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of GM Philosophy in the morning. I'm here every single day creating videos about the best game in the world, D&D. Roll some D100s for me at your next game, and I'll see you awesome people on the next one.